Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Flisher. Hey, welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. This is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure, so I get into all kinds of realms of metaphysics. But my main focus is astrology, and today we're going to be talking about, I've gone through many of the planets, working my way through the solar system, but today we're going to be talking about Uranus, which is the planet right over there. It's up behind, right after Saturn. It's one of what's called one of the outer planets, and the outer planets are known, they're called outer planets because they move so slowly. I think I mentioned in one of the other segments before that when we have the sun at the center, think of a bicycle wheel. And if the sun is at the bicycle wheel, the center is the sun, and all the planets that work their way out are like on the spokes of the bicycle wheel. But a planet that's way out here is going to move a lot slower than a planet that's in close to the beginning of into the wheel. So think of it in terms like that, and you'll get a better idea of what it looks like. Uranus is actually just beyond Saturn, so it's considered to be an outer planet. It takes 84 years for it to go around the whole zodiac, and it spends about 7 years per sign. So as it's working away around the wheel, it spends 7 years in each individual sign of the zodiac, and then it moves on. So we have halfway through the cycle, we have what's called the Uranus opposition, which happens at age 42, and then at age 84 we have what's called the Uranus return, if you make it that long, hopefully we all will, when the Uranus will return back to the spot of where it was when you were born. So it's going around that cycle and representing your history of your life. Now Uranus is an interesting planet because it is a sort of a higher octave of the planet Mercury. If you watched my segment on Mercury, you know that Mercury is the planet of the intellect. It's the planet of communication. Uranus has the same ability to communicate, but at a higher octave. Now, what do I mean by higher octave? A higher octave is more of an intellectual type. It's more of a creative type. It's a deeper type. It's a much more cerebral type of information that permeates through a larger organization. When we have planets that are out in the out realms of the universe, the outer planets, as I mentioned, because they move slower, they impact more people because they are what's considered to be generational planets. So within that 7 years that Uranus is in any sign, everybody born within that 7 years is going to have that planet in that area of their chart, and therefore will represent that planet in that capacity. Each sign represents the capacity of that individual, the personality trait. When that planet moves through that sign, then those ideas are amplified and characterized very clearly. And I'll go into that when I get into it further. Uranus is the only planet that rotates on a different axis. Most of the planets operate on this kind of an axis. Uranus rotates this way. And what's interesting about that is that one of the characteristics of Uranus is rebellion and revolution and innovation. And that is perfectly characterized by the nature of the way that planet revolves. You think about it, if the planet is going around on a different axis, its whole concept of reality is going to be different. It's going to be a different view. The perspective is different. So Uranus is known as the planet of innovation. It's the planet of rebellion. It's the planet of revolution. That's the key words we want to think of there. It's an outer planet. Takes 84 years to go around the whole zodiac, 7 years per sign, okay? Right now, when I'm broadcasting this, Uranus is in Aries, and it's been there for quite some time. It'll be there for a few more years, and while it's there, it brings out the characteristics of Uranus, as it will when it goes around all of the other signs. Where Uranus is in your chart by the house, which is dictated by the time of birth, that will indicate where you find this quality. Because one of the other characteristics of Uranus that's very interesting is that it's also known for eccentricities. Eccentricities is not a negative word. Eccentricity is the stroke of genius. Eccentricity is the signature of genius. It's where people become different. It's what makes people different. Artists who have Uranus in their 5th house, for example, are typically revolutionary. They're people who sort of go out of their way. And I have all this information on my website, turningofthewheel.com, and you'll be able to find information there about the planet Uranus, sort of the key descriptive words, and how it manifests itself through the different signs. The most obvious way to get this properly done, because it isn't true, everybody's chart is different. Even twins who are born very closely at the same point in time have different charts. And there's a good example of how I can show you how that works. The Mayans, for example, have a very good idea of how to represent time. If they showed time as a gigantic wheel spinning very quickly, like a giant wooden wheel, and they took a machete and they hit that wheel twice to represent 2 births, even though they were born at the same time, as the wheel was moving, there would still be 2 different notches on that wheel. So if you can formulate that concept in your mind, you'll understand that all of us are different in that regard, even if we have the same birthdays. I had a client several years ago who was born in March, and they found somebody who was born in Australia on the same date, and they said, oh my gosh, we've got to be soulmates. No, that's not true. Everything was different, and all of the planets and the skews in the house and everything else about them was different. Some of their basic core foundational personality traits may have been the same, but as a rule, it's not a guarantee that they're going to be getting along. Besides, who really wants to live with themselves? You want to live with someone who's the opposite of you. One of the beauties of astrology is that you find your opposite. When you find your opposite, you find that person who fills in for you what you don't have on your own. And so then you become a composite and become whole. That's why the signs are always drawn to the opposites. And that's why that phrase, opposites attract, is so appropriate. But let's get back to Uranus. Uranus, as I said, is the sign of eccentricity. So when we find it in different houses, we'll see that manifest. Uranus in the 1st house might be a person who's very unusual, a bit of eccentric in themselves. They might be very innovative. They might be sort of an unusual character in the way they present themselves to the world. They may dress odd. They may have weird personality quirks. They may be very well, have a real hidden talent. But they express themselves in and take great pride in being different. This is how they represent themselves. They take great pride in being different. They are rebellious. They are very innovative. They are unusual types of people. Uranus in the 2nd house is a person who deals with money in most unusual ways. Perhaps they earn money in ways which are very unique and unusual, maybe through an innovative startup or something like that. That's another characteristic that you'd find that. Money is the 2nd house. The 3rd house is communication. So how does a person communicate? A person with Uranus in the 3rd house might be somebody who's very outlandish, who has a very strong capacity for drama, or has a very strong capacity for speaking their mind, intellectual, a very unusual kind of, perhaps an unusual comedian, or an unusual social commentator, or an unusual writer. That's what you'd look for, something like that. A person who has the 4th house is the house of family. So the person who has Uranus in their 4th house might come from a broken family, might come from a family of equally unusual people, a family of artists, renegades, sort of bohemians, stuff like that. That's where you'd find those kinds of characters. When we come to the 5th house, as I mentioned earlier, the 5th house is the house of creativity. When you find Uranus in the 5th house, you'll find somebody who's got a wildly unique and very rebellious and different form of creativity, whether that's painting, whether that's music, whatever it may be. It will be unusual, which is the key to eccentricity, which is also the key to genius, as I mentioned earlier. When we find Uranus in the 6th house is the house of health and work, we might find somebody who does unusual forms of health work, or works in unusual forms of healthcare. And this might be rare diseases, this might be working with hospice, this might be working in areas that are not considered to be your normal healthcare situations, or your normal workplace situation. It might be somebody who has a very unusual job, working for a lighthouse worker or something like that. A very unusual, not standard job. We're not talking about plumber, policeman, teacher, or something like that. We're talking about somebody who, polishes bowling alleys or something like that. A very unusual, eccentric, unusual job. It can also be someone who is a street performer. That's how they make their living, because it's an unusual way. The 7th house is the house of relationships. When we find Uranus in the 7th house, we find people who typically find unusual relationships. and very innovative. They may be people who break trends, people who are marrying despite social mores or social customs or traditions. These are people who may break out of a strong familial tradition to marry somebody who's not of their same belief system or of a different race or even a different or the same gender. This is where we often find that sort of eccentricity. When we look to the eighth house, as I mentioned earlier, as I mentioned in other segments, is the sex and death house, or the spiritual house, or the sort of the heavy house. It's really the house of redemption and beginnings and endings. And that's more the case than anything else. So when we look there, we'll find people who are into the occult oftentimes. We'll find people who have a strong tendency towards working with unusual topics, typically not afraid of scary topics, film directors who like to deal with horror films. Wes Craven comes to mind. People like that who have a very deep, unusual sense of getting beneath the subtext of what it means to be human. When we get to the ninth house is the house of travel, education, and philosophy. So you might find somebody there who comes up with a very unusual philosophy or travels in unusual ways, perhaps a tugboat captain or someone who's chartering the Arctic Sea. Sort of the key to it there is innovation and difference. Someone who may be pioneering a new way of teaching, someone who may be pioneering a new form of spirituality, a new form of intellectual enlightenment. Very, very much the case. When we get to the 10th house, that's the house of career. Now, career is interesting because this would mean a person who had a very unusual career, much like the 6th house, as I mentioned earlier. But here, it would be something like an astrologer, for example. That's where you'd find a Uranus because it's a very unusual career. It's not something that you look up and say, that's a person who's doing something that I can recognize. It's not a school teacher, it's not a baker, it's not a plumber, it's not a lawyer or an accountant. It's somebody who's looking at something very differently. And by the way, that is where mine is. The 11th house is the house of groups and associations and friendships. And when we find Uranus there, we might find people working with unusual groups. I tend to think of communal living. I tend to think of, religious groups. I tend to think of people who are like in meetup groups who are gathering to talk about geology or something like that. But there's a distinct, unique, unusual connection that brings those people together. And so they have that very strong draw for commonality. When we look at Uranus in the 12th house, the house of transition, as I mentioned earlier, the house of transition is an interesting one because people always think of it as being the house of ending. They think, oh my gosh, that's the house where we all come and we end. It is true, endings do occur there, but it's also the house of beginnings. So when we find Uranus in the 12th house, we might find unusual departures. Sudden deaths is not unlikely. Sudden births is also not likely, is also quite likely. And it is a manner of speech that applies to beginnings and endings, which could be quite sudden. But now that I've gone through the houses, what's more important, and the best way to understand where these are in your chart is to contact me. Turningofthewheel.com is my website. www.turningofthewheel.com, my website. My email address is on there. You can contact me. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, all under this name, Chris Flischer. And if you contact me and you set up a reading with me, I can tell you exactly where all the planets are in your chart, where the houses are, and how they manifest. And when you hear that and you understand how accurate it is and how right on the money it is, you will be amazed. When I had my reading done when I was 20 years old, centuries ago, I had it done, and a perfect stranger came into me and I asked me for my birth information. So I gave my birth date, my birthplace, and my birth time. And in 2 days, she came back with a handwritten report that had me nailed better than anybody had in my life. And from that moment on, I was a firm believer in astrology. So I do know that it works. I've mentioned in the past that none of us really know how it works. We just know that it does. So we have to have a bit of faith. Most belief systems or most areas of thoughts or philosophies have no real firm foundation that we can point to and say, yes, this is an absolute. It's not like science where we can say H2O makes water. There isn't that same sort of scientific data that can back it up. There's no empirical data that can back it up. But much like a religion or much like a faith of any sort, we go on a certain degree of faith. When we see the results manifested truthfully and we know that it works because we can see the actual personality traits there, then we know we're onto something. So let's go into the Uranus in the signs. Uranus in Aries. If you have Uranus in Aries in your chart, it means that you are a very innovative, eccentric kind of pioneer. Aries is the leader of the zodiac. They're the ones that start things. They're the ones that come up with the first ideas. They're the ones that go charging through the forest, blazing the trail. They're the ram. They go charging in without even thinking twice. They'll just go blasting into the foray, and they're the ones that are very innovative. We are currently right now in the midst of a time with Uranus in Aries, and we're seeing an abundance of technology that is unsurpassed in the history of humankind. Just the simple introduction of the cell phone and the digital camera and the digital recording and the audio, everything that's being done, Skype, all the different infrastructures that has to do with telecommunications and the way we communicate are all born of Uranus in Aries during this time. If you're born during this time, you will have those characteristics. You will be an inventor. You will be a person who is going against the tide and doing it and we also see a lot of world unrest right now. So that is also a sign of rebellion. Rebellion is also a Uranian characteristic. When we move on to Uranus in Taurus might be somebody who invents who's in the food industry or in the farming industry. This is a very earth-centered sign, so we're going to see farming and things like that, very methodical, hard, fast things that are tangible. We might see innovations in there, innovations in farming, innovations in banking, innovations in big structural kinds of qualities where we'll see this unusual ability to find solutions in a very constructive and substantial way. When we see Uranus in Gemini, we will see a person who is a radical thinker, a person who has a very unusual way of delivery. Sometimes you can spot them just by their mannerisms, the way that they present themselves. Some people just have a certain body language that's so obvious that you just say, wow, that person has got to be this. And then maybe the way that they represent themselves. They may be an actor, a unique person who gets out and creates themselves in ways that are not normal. This is where, again, that word eccentricity comes in. We all think of eccentricity as being a crazy aunt someplace, but this is not the case. Eccentricity is, it's sort of like an Einstein quality. It's a quality that makes a person special and unique and great. When we see Uranus in Cancer, which is the next sign, don't forget Cancer is the sign that's ruled by the moon, so we have a very strong emotional quality there. When we see that in Cancer, Uranus in Cancer would be more of a person who has an unusual approach and is able to get through to people in a very humanistic way, with a strong sense of nurture, a strong sense of mothering. Mothering is the one word that comes to mind, but unusual, sort of someone who can help people through difficult times and do things through difficult situations where there might be some turmoil in early childhood. Oftentimes, Uranus in Cancer can indicate, if it's in the 4th house in the individual's chart, it can indicate a dissolved marriage or the sudden loss of a relative, something like that. It's where we very strongly see that. Again, the accuracy comes down to the accuracy of the chart, which can only be determined by a full-on reading with your birth date, place, and time through someone such as myself. When we move to Uranus in Leo, we might see a person who's very, very creative, very flamboyant, very unusual. Someone like an artist who does very large, dramatic, flamboyant sort of things, or an actor, perhaps, someone who's very creative and loves to express themselves in a very dynamic manner. This is something that they do very sort of revolutionary. Revolutionary is the word. They can also be a very strong leader with regard to that, because Leos are known for their leadership qualities. But you want to be looking at perhaps leading a revolution, a new kind of way of looking, a new way of looking at things, it's always about innovation. That's the one word that resonates the strongest with Uranus, is the word innovation. Innovation and rebellion. Rebellion is innovation of sorts. It's turning over the old for the new. So this is another way of looking at it. It doesn't necessarily mean charging down, Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington and attacking the Capitol or whatever country you're in. It simply means trying to find something new. When we look at Uranus in Virgo, we'll see somebody who's working in an unusual form of healthcare, perhaps, sort of an alternative therapy, maybe a yoga instructor, maybe someone who's working with acupuncture or Reiki, different forms of modalities. But this is someone who has a strong tendency towards working in a different capacity. Again, everybody has this in their chart someplace. It's a matter of you knowing where that is, and that's how you find that out, is by contacting someone such as myself. turningofthewheel.com. Chris Flisher on YouTube, Chris Flisher on Twitter, Chris Flisher on Facebook. When we look at Uranus in the sign of Libra, we will find someone who has a radical idea of new fashion, a new form of beauty, a new way of representing the way their house looks, a new form of aesthetics, a new form of intellectual discovery, revolutionary in that regard. Sort of, I think of people like Calvin Klein and famous designers who will have this ability to create something that's new and unusual and sort of really set the world aside in new and different ways. We can also find someone who's a leader there, who has a strong Uranus, who wants to overthrow a government. This could be also possible. When we move on to Scorpio, Uranus in Scorpio tends to be a person who I would say would be very secretive and has an unusual, this would be like a perfect place for a spy. It's a perfect job because there's this sort of this subterfuge, this subtext, this secrecy that goes with the Scorpio. There's always this sense of we don't always know what's going on behind the scene of the Scorpio. They're very deep, very penetrating, very intense, very loyal, wonderful people. But with Uranus in this sign, we would see someone who might be working in counterintelligence, working in spy, working for the NSA, CIA, FBI, something like that, because it's a bit of an unusual, and they're trying to find the right angles. When we look at Uranus in Sagittarius, we're looking at a person who may spend their lives traveling, sort of the reckless wandering traveler, the one that travels endlessly and never comes back because it's something different. Most people tend to have a home, but some people are just born to wander. And this may be just a lot of long drawn out wandering, or also unusual forms of religion or education, sort of delving into something that's not quite, normal. Instead of going to be a chemistry major or an English major, you might be studying, Mesopotamian pottery or something like that. These are all just references I'm pulling out of the air, but you get the idea. It's going to be an unusual, eccentric, not quite normal. And with the Sagittarius, we'd also find travel to unusual countries, looking at unusual philosophies and unusual forms of education. This would be very key, a very interesting area though. The next sign we move on to is Capricorn. Uranus in Capricorn might be someone who is a fabulous architect, someone who knows how to build and can build, because Capricorn is the sign of the foundation. It's an earth sign, it's an earth cardinal sign, meaning that's the first one to do it, sort of innovative. But there might be like the Frank Gehry's of the world, the unusual architects, the people who build buildings that are not like anybody else. The people who have that tendency to sort of strike out into new territories. Also, Capricorn is ruled by Saturn historically, but when Uranus is in Capricorn, we might find people who, as I say, work in unusual organizations, large foundational organizations, things that are just a little bit outside. Someone who's trying to save the earth, trying to find new ways of reclaiming water, for example. Innovation, this is the type of thing. Climate change, looking at climate change. Maybe a person who works for Greenpeace might be someone who has Uranus in Capricorn, because you see what you have there. We don't have the usual job. Greenpeace is not a usual job. Running around in an inflatable boat on the Arctic Circle chasing after whale fishers is not a usual job. It's not like sitting behind a desk typing in status reports. You see my point. So that's the interesting part there. When we move to Uranus in Aquarius, we see the person who rules and governs and behaves in unusual fashions with regard to the globe. The role of the Aquarius is that of the greater human condition. They are people who love to work for the betterment of humanity. Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt are the two people that come to mind always as we think of great Aquarians. There's many more, of course, but because they have that ability to sort of not be focused on themselves, their view is, how do we change the world in a radical new way? Which way do we go? How do we solve this problem? And these are great problem solvers. They're very intellectual, but they are a fixed sign. So when Uranus is there, whatever form of eccentricity that they espouse, it's going to be one that is either their way or not, or the highway, because they like to have that ability to be able to have that strong dictum which allows them to be firm in their approach and solid in their decision making, which is a very wonderful quality. When we see Uranus In Pisces, finally, Uranus in Pisces is the realm of the dreamer. It's the realm of the visionary. It's the realm of the artist. It's the realm of the mystic, lost poet. It's the realm of the religious person. It's the realm of the deep thinker. It's the realm of the person who's lost in the clouds and in the dream world. Uranus in Pisces would indicate a person who is radically thinking of that world very differently. It's a question of trying to find new ways of perhaps poetry, perhaps filmmaking would be a good place to find someone like that. A strong artist with a very radical, innovative kind of quality. You know, don't forget, Uranus, when I talk about rebellion in Uranus, I talk about doing something that's not been done before. Rebellion is about doing something that's not been done before. Revolution is about turning things over a new leaf, starting something new. Innovation, rebellion, eccentricity, those are all doing things differently. They all point to the same quality. So wherever that manifests itself in your chart, that is where you will see your energy go towards that. Now, when I do readings with people, I have to understand that it's all theme-based, so that I would look at a person and I'd say, this is where your Uranus is in your chart, this is where it manifests itself in your particular chart. Through that discovery, you'd be able to find out where your greatest talents are. I believe Uranus to be the seed of genius in the individual because it is different. We all have different characteristics. When you apply that to a generation, you would see whole generations. As I mentioned, it's an outer planet, so it has generational appeal to it. So for 7 years, you're going to have people born into that with that characteristic in that sign, having that characteristic. That's where you'll see whole generations will be moving towards a certain way. We've seen that. We're living in a cell phone generation right now, but we know that that's the case. The key piece about Uranus is this ability to, remember it's the 84-year cycle around the sun, and when you get to the opposition at 42, typically we'll see people at the age of 42. This is a very common thing in astrology and in my own personal practice when I've seen people. At age 42, people go through that famous midlife crisis. That's right. 42 is typically what we consider, and that's a range, a broad range. It could be, 3.5, 4 years on either side of it, but it's going to be within that range. When people decide, they wake up and they see themselves like, I'm 42, what have I done? How am I going to do this? Am I happy with my wife? Am I happy with my job? Do I want to do something different? I see many clients who totally upend their lives at that point in their life, and they say it's time for a change. And it may not be dramatic. They may just leave their job and go someplace else. But it is a sign of internal unrest when people want to move. So just keep that in mind. Remember, turningofthewheel.com is my website. I need your birth date, your birthplace, and your birth time. When I have those three things, I can construct a chart for you that will give you granular, amazing accuracy about who you are as an individual, where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, where your assets are, and where your liabilities are, and allow you to live your life to the fullest in every capacity possible. Astrology, as I said, well, we don't know how it works, but we know it does. Just like many of the great religions or other belief systems that are out there. We don't know why they work, but they work for some people. And I know that astrology works, and I encourage you to try it out. www.turningofthewheel.com or chrisflisher.com or turningofthewheel.tv. All of the above will get you to me, okay? And I'll see you all in the next segment.